folks to join us this morning. I want to welcome all those that have already joined to our Business Smarts Online webinar series, which is during this period. We're going weekly, and we're pleased to talk about what will be a subject matter, I suspect, for quite some time, labor law this morning. I want to thank you all for joining us. I'm Dan Rogers. I'm the Executive Director for the Kelowna Chamber of Commerce. Pleased to have with us from Pushor Mitchell, Mark Grabas. We'll have a more formal introduction to Mark, who looks like, I think you've joined us from Hawaii this morning, Mark. So it's excellent. We're all getting familiar with Zoom and also the backgrounds we can utilize. So it's interesting times that we are in indeed. Just want to let folks know that have joined us, if this is your first time coming to some of our webinar series, first of all, thank you. We want to welcome all those members of chambers, whether you're a member of the Kelowna Chamber or one of the members of the chambers throughout the Okanagan Valley. We are cooperating with our colleagues during these challenging times to bring this type of information to members and business leaders right across the Okanagan Valley. So if you're a member of a local chamber in Peachland or Penticton or in Vernon, thanks also for joining us this morning. We are providing, though, this series universally at no cost to the business community right across the board throughout the valley and those that are tuning in. And we are getting some interest from those outside the valley as well. I want to thank you for joining us. If you haven't been on Zoom before, you can check out your menu bar at the bottom. At any time, you can pose a question. It'll show up for Mark and I, and we'll get to as many of those as we can. If there are some lingering by the end of the hour, we will do some work to get that information back to you. I just wanted to note, we are an advocacy organization, so if in our communications there is information you want to share, please let us know, and we continue to operate as well. So I want to thank those that have joined us. At this stage, I'm going to turn things over to Mark. I'm going to introduce Mark first of all. Thanks for joining us, by the way.
My pleasure.
I think all of us, particularly many businesses, are trying to understand the situation we're in, and in particular as we move into a potential restart. What does that look like? What does that mean for my employees? There is a lot of uncertainty. We're fielding a lot of calls from the business community and our members in that regard. Mark's a trusted advisor, negotiator, and advocate with Pushor Mitchell in their employment law group. For almost 20 years, he's advised and represented clients on all aspects of employment law, as well as labor law, WorkSafeBC claims, appeals, assessments, and occupational health and safety issues in the workplace. In addition, he assists clients with collective bargaining, grievances, arbitration, and the drafting and implementation of human resource, disability, WorkSafeBC, and occupational health and safety policies and procedures, many of which I suspect are being reviewed, rewritten, updated, considered, reflected upon. And it is a time of change and uncertainty. So Mark, we want to certainly thank you for joining us. You've worked in the public and private sector, involved in with those types of employers, involved in a wide range of activities. Mark, I want to thank you in particular for joining us. We have about an hour. I'm going to turn things over to you. You can walk us through, and then we'll get into a bit more of a conversation.
Sounds good. Thanks very much, Dan. So I'm just going to share my screen here. So in terms of what I've done is I've captured a number of the different headlines that we've seen over the last few weeks and months. And what I want to do is sort of put those in context in terms of what the employment and labor ramifications are. And as we saw yesterday, Premier Horgan extended the current state of affairs for at least the next 2 weeks. And so what you're going to hear throughout this presentation is there's going to be three things. One is unprecedented. These truly are unprecedented times for everyone, and everyone's trying to navigate it. That includes the government, the courts, employers, and employees. The next thing you're going to hear a lot about is what's reasonable. And in these unprecedented times, the general expectation is that people are going to do what's reasonable. Unfortunately, what's reasonable is very subjective. And so that's largely going to depend on what people's individual interpretations are. The last thing that you're going to hear often is it depends. And really, in these times, there is no certainty and every situation is unique. So the first thing I want to talk about a bit is layoffs. And there seems to be a lot of questions around layoffs. Who can you lay off and who you can't lay off? And so under employment standards in BC, you really legally cannot lay somebody off unless there's a term in their contract that explicitly says that you can lay them off on a temporary layoff. Otherwise, this means that they are essentially immediately terminated at that point. As I said before, these are extremely unprecedented times. So how the courts may interpret this is still going to be open as to if there's going to be some leeway given to employers. Another question that we get in terms of layoffs is, can an employer require an employee to take reduced wages or accept less hours? And the quick answer to that again is no. Anything that's seen as a significant or harmful change to the employment, including rates of pay, hours of work, and also anything that may affect benefits, commissions, bonuses, or allowances, is specifically going to be considered constructive dismissal. And so again, we're in this uncertain time that we're not really sure how the Canadian courts are going to handle those situations. It's my belief that employers are probably going to be given some leeway in these challenging times in order to try to maintain their business, keep them open instead of shutting down completely. But again, this remains to be seen in terms of what's going to happen once we actually come out of this. For those of you that are remaining open, you likely have a number of employees that are working from home. And working from home is going to be interesting for a number of different reasons. In terms of what your obligations as an employer are, you should be doing some of your regular HR things. You should be continuing to check in on them regularly. You should be making sure that they remain engaged. But also, you really need to look at your policies in terms of confidentiality, what's going on, especially when people are working at home and taking work home. Non-disclosure, any sort of IT security. As we've seen and heard a number of times, there's been a number of Zoom bombings that have taken place where people have been able to hack into Zoom meetings. So looking at what your security is and what risks it poses for certain people working at home. The other interesting thing about working from home is that employers have the exact same health and safety responsibilities for an employee that's working at home as if that employee was actually working in the workplace. Now, WorkSafeBC is unlikely to come into your employee's home and inspect them, but they may come into your workplace and they may ask for your working from home health and safety plan. They may want to see that you've done inspections of the employee's office space at home. And they may be looking for health and safety committee minutes to verify that any issues that have been brought up with respect to working at home have been addressed, and also that you're actually considering what happens when employees are working from home. The other interesting fact, and this was released not long ago, is that employers are still required to pay all of their WorkSafeBC premiums, whether an employee is working from home or whether they're still receiving the federal wage subsidy. And this can have serious ramifications if employers do not pay their premiums, because you can be subject to fines, or you may find that you don't have coverage, in which case you may be responsible for paying the entire value of the claim yourself. So there are some risks to that, and it's very important to make sure that you do keep current on your premiums. There is the possibility as well that employees could file WorkSafeBC claims for exposure to viruses at work. The other thing to remember is that employees working at home can still file WorkSafeBC claims if they are injured while working at home. And so that's a real risk as well. So it's important to be regularly checking in with your employees. And if you can, having them take photos or do some sort of visual inspection of what their workspace looks like to minimize that risk. And some of you may think that it's pretty far-fetched to think that'll happen. I've dealt personally with a number of cases where people have been injured while working at work at home. And one of the ones was somebody went to make a cup of tea and ended up suffering severe burns due to the hot water, and it was deemed that that was part of their coffee break during their working at home, so they were actually covered for that completely. So there are examples of where this has taken place, and I can almost guarantee that the board is going to take a more stringent approach in terms of looking at working at home as being equating it to the workplace and probably accepting more claims. Also, to touch back on premiums for a minute, and with respect to WorkSafeBC premiums, the way premiums are calculated is everybody has an experience rating, and that experience rating is taken as a ratio of your claims costs divided by your payroll. And so what we're going to see is if somebody has laid off a number of employees and they may have had some WorkSafeBC claims, they're going to see that their claims costs are still going up or continuing, but their payroll is going down significantly. So what this is going to mean is that if in the past you have had a discount, you may see your discount disappear and you may actually get a surcharge. If you've had a surcharge, you may actually see your surcharge go up as a result of this. The other important thing to realize is that your WorkSafeBC claims are still going on regardless of whether your business is open or not. So that's something to be aware of as well, that there are costs that are being incurred, and it's important to check in on those employees, see what's going on, and also check in on the board to see what options you have available in terms of being able to control those claims costs. Because come October, when you get your rate statement and it sets your rates for 2021, you don't want to be surprised by what you see. WorkSafeBC has also done focused inspections specifically with respect to COVID. And this is going to be important for those people that remain open, and likely it's going to be even more important for those businesses that are looking to reopen, where there's going to be a focus on WorkSafeBC coming in to ensure that they're meeting all of their health and safety obligations. And if you're not meeting your health and safety obligations, you could be subject to orders or penalties. And those orders and penalties can be appealed. And also, they're very important because depending on your business, a history of receiving orders or penalties can impact your ability to get contracts and to do other work in other sectors. So it's really important that you're aware of what those are and that you're meeting your responsibilities. In terms of what WorkSafeBC is actually going to look for when they come in to inspect a workplace, there's no specific regulations that exist that deal with COVID-19. What they're relying on is their general regulations with respect to exposure to biological agents, any of the regulations that deal with hygiene, hand washing. And then what they're really going to focus on is fitting everything under this overarching obligation in the Workers' Compensation Act that employers have to ensure the health and safety of their workers. Now, each inspector is going to determine what's adequate in these situations because it's not really well defined. And so it's going to be very subjective. So one inspector comes in and says that, well, physical distancing is appropriate in this situation. Perhaps if you make your staircases one way only, then you're going to be covered off. Whereas another workplace may require masks, gloves, and face shields in order to be able to open and to be able to meet the requirements as set by WorkSafe. So it's really going to take a concerted effort on behalf of employers to look at what their workplace is, look at the business that they do, look at who they're interacting with and how, especially when they reopen, and how they're going to be able to protect their employees and the people coming to their business from the potential effects of COVID-19. And so why is all of this important? Well, as we've seen in Alberta, there's been a situation at the Cargill plant where there were a number of people, there were almost 300 people that fell ill with COVID and 2 people died as a result of that. And what this has done is this has created a huge health and safety awareness around what could potentially happen in a workplace if you were to see this very significant spread of the disease. What this also means is that it's also happening in our own backyard. There's been a number of poultry plants and a number of meat processing plants in BC that have had positive tests for COVID. And the reason that we've seen these outbreaks, the one in Alberta and the one in BC, is that employees are really afraid of missing work because they don't want to lose those wages. They really need those wages to be able to survive on a day-to-day basis. And so they're taking the risk and they're coming to work. The government's response initially was stay home. And as we know, it's easier said than done for people to stay home. In most cases, if they don't work, they don't get paid. And it seems like the government came to realize that as well. And what they're looking at is looking at sick pay options for part-time and casual workers. What is also interesting is, as an employer, if you don't want your employees to come to work sick or when they're not feeling well, you need to look at what your sick plans are. So is there something that you can offer your employees that's going to persuade them that they should be staying home when they're not feeling well or when they're ill, as opposed to coming into work? Another option to consider as part of that is, if somebody is away ill, do you really require a medical note to verify that sickness? Especially now, trying to get verification of different illnesses is going to be very difficult with most medical clinics shut down and trying to do it over video conference. It would be generally easier that having people come back when they're well, as opposed to putting that other imposition on them, because if they feel that they're going to have to go through the hassle of trying to get a medical note to come back to work, they may just stay at work instead of going off at all. And that creates the risk of actually having one of these catastrophic spreads of COVID or another disease through that. And again, the reason that this is so very important is, as we've seen in the Cargill case, where there were about 300 cases of COVID and 2 deaths, this has led people in Alberta to actually call for a criminal investigation. And they really want to investigate the circumstances at the Cargill plant and why, whether there was some non-compliance or something else that took place that caused this outbreak and the resulting deaths. And all this is based on, it goes back to the 2004 Westray Act, where employers may be prosecuted under the criminal code for any workplace incidents that result in injury or death. The other thing to realize is, even though that's in Alberta, it applies equally in BC. And there is a real possibility of that happening in BC. For some time now, and this is in relation to the fires that took place at the sawmills, WorkSafeBC has really been looking at strengthening its ability to bring charges under the criminal code. And so as an employer, this is something to be very aware of, that you have everything in order and in line and you are protecting your employees. Otherwise, you may be exposing yourself to a charge under the criminal code. Again, even if you decide to reopen, the employees may not feel safe. So what happens in those situations where an employee claims not to feel safe coming back to work? So WorkSafeBC has health and safety regulations that include the provisions to allow a worker to refuse work they believe to be unsafe. For an employee to do that, it has to be a reasonable belief. So it's all going to depend on what the nature of the workplace is. If there's physical distancing, if there's been no cases, if there's been no exposure to COVID, then it's really not going to be, there's not going to be that risk. And that's when you have to look at the suspected safety risk. Is there the risk that they're actually going to be exposed to COVID? It's very different in a manufacturing facility or in an office environment in cubicles versus actually being in a healthcare setting where people may be regularly exposed to this. Also looking at what the individual needs of the employee are. You may have some employees that are immunocompromised that if they were exposed to COVID, that it could be catastrophic for them. And so that's something to really be aware of, as well as to take into account their personal circumstances. And then also looking at what's reasonable in the circumstances. If there's absolutely no risk, if there is no cases of COVID, if the opportunity to be exposed to COVID is completely minimized by the employer, then it's not really reasonable to actually refuse to come to work. And so in general, I ask employers to be very careful around that as well. Some employers would prefer to discipline employees in those situations. The Workers' Compensation Act does prohibit discrimination, is what it's called, is taking any sort of repercussions against an employee who raises safety concerns. Again, if it is something that is completely preposterous, then those are situations where you may have to look at disciplining an employee. But again, I'd ask that you get advice on that prior to do that, because all of the circumstances in each situation is going to be very unique. This brings me now to reopening and what we're going to look at in terms of once BC starts to reopen for business. And generally, the way that WorkSafe is going to look at this and what the requirements are going to be is that we're looking at the frequency of sanitizing, cleaning all of workstations, cleaning all the high traffic areas, the same sort of things that are going on now, encouraging physical distancing between employees, there's probably going to be an avoidance of in-person meetings as well. And we're going to see more of these Zoom type and these virtual meetings that are going on as well. Looking at the provision of hand sanitizer in workplaces to make sure that people are sanitizing their hands and washing their hands, increasing signage in certain areas. And we've seen this really in the construction industry where they've been allowed to stay open and work during these times, is they've been very diligent in having signage available and in putting up that signage to make people aware of what's going on. The other thing to be aware of during all of this is that you're likely going to be recalling employees. If you have temporarily laid off employees, you're going to be recalling them. And if it's within that 13-week period, then they're going to be considered continuous employees. So everything that they were entitled to before is going to be exactly the same when they come back to work. The next thing to be aware of when we reopen is that there are all of the predictions of a second wave that's coming, and it's likely going to happen in the fall combined with the seasonal flu. And if this comes to pass, the prospects and the predictions are very dire in terms of the impact it could have. It will likely seem that what we're doing now is a dry run compared to what the predictions could be. And that's why it's really important in terms of your health and safety obligations that looking at what you're doing now, so that if there is this second wave, you are absolutely prepared for that and you have everything in place to be able to address that, and you'll be able to stay open and to be able to carry on work throughout that second phase. The other complex challenge is a lot of people are relying on a vaccine as the panacea. This vaccine is going to save us and everything will go back to work. The one thing that sort of frustrates that a bit is that you can't make vaccination mandatory. It is mandatory in some healthcare settings where it's required to actually protect the workers and to protect the patients. But in most cases, an employer cannot actually make it mandatory that their employees get vaccinated. So what can happen is you could actually have susceptible people in your workplace. And that's where you again have to look at what are your sick leave provisions going to look like, and actually preventing people from coming into work who are not feeling well and who actually may be carriers for COVID. And so that's really important to realize as well in terms of moving forward. How does that look? Are you reviewing your HR policies to see what can we do in these cases to make sure that we are looking out for our employees and then overall your business as well? And that's all I have for today. So I'm more than happy to take any questions. So if we want to move on to questions right now, that would be great.
Well, thanks very much, Mark, and I'll get you just to unshare, and then we'll get into some questions. I want to thank again for you taking some time. I'm not sure if I feel better or worse with the opening. There is a lot of uncertainty out there. We have a number of questions, again, for those that have joined us. We've got a good crowd with us this morning, so that's great. Please use the Q&A. We'll get to as many questions. We've got a fair bit of time here. And if you want, you can use the chat. We can get questions that way as well. I want to start just with a question around the labor profession. You integrate, with some of the work that's happening provincially with WorkSafe, the various ministries. Is there increased communication and clarification? Because one of the things that we're hearing right now, and we're in discussions through our partners at the BC Chamber, is on the 13 weeks. And if that currently is constructive dismissal, and there's a consequence to that, and that time frame for some businesses is getting closer. Is that communication ongoing? Are you getting briefings from the profession and from the ministry to keep you up to date in that regard?
So generally, there hasn't been a lot that's been released on that so far. The only thing that's been released so far is Employment Standards set a release that sort of defined what it meant by one of the provisions in there that allowed employers not to pay severance if the contract was frustrated. And what they've said is they're going to look at that very stringently. COVID may apply in certain circumstances, but there has to be that impossibility of people working and of people closing the business. And so right now in other provinces, they have the ability to extend that 13 weeks. We haven't seen anything in BC and we haven't heard anything. My expectation is, depending on how the state of emergency continues to move forward, that we may actually see that being extended, as well as some of these other additional sick benefits coming into play that are encouraging people to stay home and not forcing them to come back into the workplace.
Right. And we're, the BC Chamber, and certainly through our network, are pushing the government on that to ensure, at least at minimum, that there's an extension. We have one in the chat from Patricia that talks about, and I think this is applicable for small businesses, not in a unionized environment, and likely most of our conversation will be around there. We want to ensure that we keep running as much as possible. We want to be fair to all our employees. We don't want to lose some employees. So naturally you gravitate towards a conversation of, well, the revenue is not there. Can you ask, and how would you approach to dealing with the compensation issue and getting concurrence from the team for an overall reduction? It's challenging just in that conversation. There's a lot of goodwill on the owner or the manager's side, but it's a challenging situation, and noted by Patricia, if you could respond to that.
It is a very challenging situation. The best thing that you can do is ask if somebody will voluntarily take a wage cut. As I discussed briefly in the presentation, if you are actually just going to unilaterally take away their wages, that could be considered a constructive dismissal. Now that's when the employee has to decide, if it is a constructive dismissal, they actually have to leave the workplace, try to find other work at the same time, and then try to file, they'd have to recover that through the court system. So that's where talking with your employees and negotiating with your employees, you're likely going to get a better result than just trying to unilaterally change their wage rate, and to get them agree to it would be the best way, so that you can avoid any issues down the road. And also trying to set the parameters in terms of when you're going to increase their wage again, because that's going to be very important for them as well, is to have some sort of level, even though it's uncertain times, some sort of certainty of when they may consider that things are going to get back to almost normal.
Would you do that individually or collectively in a group discussion if you have 5 or 6 team members?
With wages, it's always better to try to discuss it individually. Yeah. Money is always a very, very sensitive topic. Yeah.
We've got lots of questions, which is great. So we're going to go through these as quickly, and I'll try to go and read them off for you without getting too deep into which will be specifics, but generally. So we have a situation, a question. We laid off several employees with working notice of the time frame required by the length of their employment. One was laid off immediately with severance. This employer intends to hire back all employees, but would like to know what the options are for one that we laid off with severance. Is it different because they treated employees? Are they required to hire her back, as an example?
So as you've paid the employee severance, you've essentially terminated the employment relationship. So the short answer is you have no requirement to hire her back.
Great. Next question is, does WorkSafeBC think that people would let their employer into their home to inspect their office? So there's a reference of that. It's applicable. Any cases where that's occurred, or are you just telling people to be cautious?
I'm telling people to be cautious. What they need is, WorkSafeBC fully expects that employers will have seen the workspace that employees are using to work from home. And there can be ramifications if they haven't done those inspections. So they may be subject to orders, they may be subject to penalties depending on what the situation is. And that's where the importance of keeping documentation that you have policies for working at home, and that you even have the employee doing a self-inspection that they can report to you on a regular basis. And the minimum should be about every month.
One of the interesting observations that we've made here, and in some discussions, and it's been reinforced with our elected leaders, there can be an interpretation of mixed communication when you have the Prime Minister or the Premier saying, stay at home. And then yesterday in the Premier's news conference said, I never closed golf courses. And so there is a combination of, and I think maybe the guidance, and we've certainly say, listen to the medical health officer, but also double check. And there's a difference between an order and a recommendation. And we've got a question that's, how do you know as an employer if you're meeting the responsibilities and expectations for reopening? Any guidance can you give or direction that you would make, aside from make sure you understand the difference between an order and a recommendation?
That's absolutely it, is understanding the difference between an order and a recommendation, and also understanding what's been published in terms of the expectations of businesses that are staying open or reopening. And that's when you're looking at the physical distancing, you're looking at the sanitizing. If I could have invested in plexiglass about 8 weeks ago, that would be the way to go. And that's what we're seeing, is people putting up physical barriers in terms of trying to limit the spread. And so that's what your expectations are going to be, is what are you doing to limit the spread or the potential spread of COVID if somebody has it? And that's going to be the key, is ensuring, and again, it's going to be very unique and very specific to every workplace.
Yeah, I had a conversation with someone the other day that, by the way, that's an oil-based product. That's a natural resource that enables us to have those plexiglass. That's how important the resource sector is for us in BC
Exactly.
and in Canada, right? So could you speak to employer responsibility for cleaning and sanitizing office locations, bathrooms? Should this become a staff responsibility or a qualified cleaning company? And I think we're getting a lot of these questions even into the chamber around, what is my obligation and how does that match the expectations of the employee who may have a different perspective returning to that environment?
Yeah, no, that's exactly it. Employers generally have the overarching responsibility. In terms of the cleaning, they can assign that to staff as long as that's within their job duties. The part you have to be careful of is, one, making sure that they're adequately protected when they're doing that sanitizing, and also that it sort of falls within their job duties and it's not going to be seen as demeaning or taking them outside what their regular job duties are, because you can run into some HR issues there as well. You can always hire a qualified cleaning company. That's probably not necessary. Most employers have staff that are going to be fully capable of wiping down all the high contact surfaces. You're looking at elevators, handrails, any doorknobs, anything that's touched frequently, and having a regular schedule for that. I was in, I think it was Walmart not long ago, and an announcement came over the loudspeaker every 15 minutes saying, okay, it's time to sanitize. Everybody sanitizes. And so it's having that regular schedule documented as well will protect you if you run into any issues with WorkSafeBC as well.
We've had a number of calls and contacts from our members in the business community that they've illustrated certain situations. One of those was a desire for an employee to return to work, the employee not comfortable because of the current situation, and then outlining, well, I've heard from that I'm supposed to stay at home, I'm not willing to come back. The employer then says, well, then you're working towards dismissal because I've requested you, I've created that environment. But there is an angst, so there is a bit of a bridge into mental health, right? And is this, do we just wait and see case law, what transpires, or any guidance you can give to the employer in that situation?
So with respect to that, it's exactly like you said, we're going to have to see what case law is. But if we go on what the current law is employees have that right to refuse unsafe work as long as it's reasonable. If the employer has put all of these precautions in place and eliminated the risk, then it's no longer reasonable not to be at work. And so they could actually request people come into work. Again, unless there's specific situations where they may be immunocompromised or they may have other health issues, which would make it particularly dangerous for them to be exposed. And in that case, they would actually be at a higher risk, and you'd have to look at those as particular unique situations.
It's interesting, Ed, because recommendations in even wearing a mask, right? There's been a lot, and even I think the views of some of the medical professions has changed in Canada on that in general population. Can you force an employee or suggest that it's required if another employee doesn't feel comfortable that some are in the workplace that aren't wearing a mask, as an example?
So you can ask your employees not to wear masks, especially if they're public facing and things, and there is no risk of them being exposed. If there is a risk of them being exposed, it is definitely in your best interest that they probably have a mask if they feel comfortable wearing one. Because again, you don't want to deal with those liability issues where you had the ability to prevent somebody from getting infected and you did not use those means.
There's a question with someone, and I don't know if they're on maternity leave or not, someone that is pregnant, refusing to work even after the employer has listed the precautions that they've taken. What's the employer's obligation in those circumstances?
Again, that's likely going to depend on a doctor's note from the pregnant employee, because there may be certain circumstances with the pregnancy that may prohibit that, they may not be exposed to that. So that could be an issue as well. That's where I'd have to turn it over to the medical professionals in terms of what's going to have to be. I am definitely not an expert on pregnancy. So.
Yeah, and it's interesting, the different scenarios that we get and situations that are being described. If a salary employee takes sick leave, then wants to come back, can they be laid off due to reduced business activity?
Again, that goes back to some of the previous comments. In terms of layoffs, you can't legally lay somebody off unless there's an explicit term in their contract. So you could try to lay them off. Again, as I discussed briefly, nobody really knows how that's going to be treated by the courts. And that's where it's going to be a big issue. Is from most of the conversations that I've had with employees, they're more concerned about keeping their employment going forward, knowing how difficult it's going to be to find additional employment. So they're willing to accept that temporary layoff. And then once business activities pick up, to go back to work.
But under the ESA, under the Employment Standards Act, if there is no work, right, there is a step in a process to lay employees off because there is no work that exists, right?
There is. It's not sure whether that's actually going to apply or not. So it's pretty risky. If they close down completely, it's likely that under employment standards, it would be seen as that they were unable to carry out their contract and they would be laid off. They would be legitimately laid off. Yes.
As an employer, we're able to start a phased in kind of return to work. And I think that's being recommended under health and safety requirements. We are deemed an essential service in this case, and are considering May 19th as an example as the startup return. Your suggestions that this would be wholly acceptable. And I think we come back to, the difference between a recommendation and an order. I'm assuming you've carried on. There might be
we have
amount of business, right?
Yep.
We've carried on, right?
And we are considered an essential service right now as well. So that's one of the reasons that we've carried on.
Right. And so we would not be, but we still were able to live under the orders with a dispersed workforce and carry on.
Exactly.
And golf courses, as an example, they weren't, as the Premier noted, there were those that if they could meet the orders, which required social spacing and no gathering, no large gathering, could continue to operate. And we see that in even some of the retail businesses in the city of Kelowna are starting, and they're putting their own processes in place. Any guidance? Is it just due diligence to be able to demonstrate you are trying your best to meet that test of social distancing? So limiting people in, reasonable test, has been the past practice on these things?
Exactly. It is going to all come down to reasonableness. The other part of it is it's all going to come down to documentation. Have you documented what policies and procedures you put in place to address this? How are you maintaining the social distancing or the physical distancing? Also, how are you doing all your sanitizing? Are you doing it on a regular basis? And what are you doing in those situations, right? So it's having those documents present that show the efforts that you're making to carry out all of these things. And you'll be meeting what the spirit and what the reasonableness is of the orders and of the recommendations.
Just a reminder to those that have joined us, and thank you again on behalf of the Kelowna Chamber joining us, no matter where you are in the Okanagan Valley. If you're new to Zoom, welcome. You're getting used to the new technology, as most of us are. There is a Q&A bar at the bottom. We've got lots of questions we're going to move through over the next 20 minutes. You can also use the chat function. I'll monitor that. And we are recording this session, and we'll post it on the Chamber website. We've got a special section and pages dedicated to providing information to the business community on COVID-19, including a number of webinars that we've done, including this one today with Mark. Also, we have information and links to go to the government sources and those agencies that are responsible for delivering some of the programs that have been announced by the federal and provincial government. Plus, we're sharing some good news stories and some examples of some businesses that have responded in a very productive way and positive way to put in procedures so that they can continue to operate and continue to keep the economy going as best as possible. Lisa, first of all, Lisa says, hi, Mark. So I'm not sure if you know who Lisa is. I'll just leave it at Lisa. If an employee's family member is immune compromised, does that allow the employee to refrain themselves coming into the work environment where they feel they may be putting themselves at risk and possibly presenting the chance to bring the virus home? So, and I think it might extend to even the personal environment too. It's an interesting question.
It is, it definitely is. And a lot of it's going to depend on what the specific situation is. So is there the opportunity to work from home and to have everything done by home? If that's the case, then it would seem reasonable to have that person working from home if they can actually complete all of their job duties. There is a provision also that people may be entitled to certain leaves if they feel that they can't come into work because of certain reasons that are related to COVID, but those are unpaid leaves at this point. So they're not paid leaves, and they would have to look at some sort of other government funding to be able to fill that gap. Again, it's all going to be very specific depending on what the workplace is and depending on what the risk is of it being brought into the workplace. So there's a lot of factors that play into it. And so again, it's going to fall into that category that I described earlier about it depends. So a lot of it's going to depend on what the specific situation is.
Does the employer have the right to ask for confirmation of that there is someone immune compromised within your family structure and a note from a doctor or something that indicates that?
So if generally privacy wouldn't allow that, especially to report on other people's medical conditions, a lot of the time you're just going to have to take their word for it that this is the issue that's going on and that it's going to be reasonable under those circumstances.
Great, thanks very much. If an employee takes a day off, do we still have to pay them for full day's pay? They're a seasonal business installing solar systems on roofs and include vacation pay and the hourly wage. I'm not sure.
That all depends on why they're taking the day off.
Yeah.
So if they're taking it as a vacation day, then if their vacation's already in their hourly wage, then it would be an unpaid day if they were taking it as a vacation day. But I'm not sure exactly what the question's getting at.
Yeah. So if there could be a clarity on that, that'd be great. Recommendations do you give? You look at the large employees with a unionized workforce, there's collective agreements, there's process in place. But for the really small ones that you and potentially clients you come across, do you recommend that they have clear employment standards articulated in a handbook or something? So at least they have a starting point. And should they be looking at those now, developing a policy around COVID, updating that policy? Any guidance you can give the?
Absolutely. So those are some of the things that we've discussed with a number of our clients, is looking at updating your policies to cover that. Also looking at your employment contracts. As I discussed earlier, if there's no specific provision for layoffs in your employment contract, then you can't legally do it. So we're really recommending that employers look at their employment contracts and put in those layoff provisions that should something like this happen again, that you have the ability to lay off employees without having to look at what the legal repercussions of that may be.
Excellent. Mark, we've got a lot of questions to cover in about the same number of minutes left. So I've used this before. We'll move into the bullet round. So I'll ask these and I'm repeating them on the fly here. So I'll try to interpret as best we can the way that they've been imposed. An employee, as in this case, uses public transit to travel to and from work. and they're concerned about the potential use and exposure on public transit to COVID and would prefer to continue to work from home once the office reopens. The employer has listed, reviewed, and demonstrated safety precautions to minimize the employee risk in the workplace. So the workplace is good. They feel comfortable. Due diligence has occurred. Can the employer insist that the employees return to their place at work? And in this circumstance, because the employee feels risk in getting to the workplace.
Yes. Yeah. So in most cases, employees are responsible for finding their own way to work. And as long as the workplace is safe, that's the only thing that the employer can control. They can't control what's outside of the work environment, and they're not responsible for controlling what's outside the work environment. That would have to be a conversation with your employer in terms of whether there was the opportunity to work from home or whether their options may be available to you.
Yeah, great
I'll try
question.
to keep these as brief as we can.
No, that's a great answer and a really good question. Are there any requirements or considerations for mental health issues occurring in the workplace as a result of the increased stress of COVID? A whole new area, right?
Yeah, there's always mental health issues, and mental health issues are key regardless of whether we're in the situation that we currently are with COVID or not. And that's where it's important that employers have those resources available, especially in this time of COVID. One really good thing is that there's been a number of the large employee assistance program companies that are offering free services and free counseling during this time. So there are resources that are available to help your employees, even if you don't have that plan yourself.
So there's a question from Lucy. Is or will there be a publication to assist with developing policy documentation around returning to work? Interesting, on the government website, there are PDFs that describe each sector, but it's really general, difficult to find. Any guidance you would give those small employers?
Again, each situation is going to be unique, and I find it highly unlikely that they're going to have specific documentation that's going to cover every workplace. It's going to be mostly the general provisions that we spoke about earlier: physical distancing, doing the sanitizing, putting in those things where you're reducing the in-person meetings and the possible exposure through those means.
Yeah, we are through, even on our website, we'll put a link to the government site where you can look at where there are some general guidelines for each sector that are there, but we'll continue to monitor that and communicate that out as best we can. Again, what we've suggested to those that have contacted us, and you're probably getting the same, Mark, is be sure you go on to the government website and look at what the orders are. Those are must follow. And then many others are general recommendations and, good intent, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Question around cash flow. I don't anticipate being able to hire all my employees back. Are there repercussions? So who do you select in coming back? Also, we don't have paid sick days. Can I still ask an employee to stay home due to illness?
So yes,
So
if you have the right, so there's two
there,
questions. Right? So I'll answer the
Yeah.
second one first. If you have policies that require somebody to stay home when they're ill, that's going to be based on what your internal policies are. In terms of the repercussions, if you've laid them off for a period of 13 weeks, then they're considered terminated, and you would be liable to pay them any sort of severance or termination based on their length of service.
Great. Quick follow-up from a previous question. We did tell the employee who was given severance that, like the rest of the team, she was being laid off due to COVID. She is expected to be hired back when the rest of the team is rehired. We may have communicated incorrectly with this employee because it seems like it was treated differently. Any suggestions of how to correct that, or?
That's going to be a communication issue. Essentially, yeah, you've paid the severance, so they are a terminated employee. That's going to have to have a conversation that you're going to have to talk about why you're not taking them back.
Next one, if there is an employee that is underperforming, was doing so prior to COVID, and has been decided to let that employee go, the employee will be paid severance for the time worked. Are there any ramifications or legal concerns that need to be considered when firing employees in the current situation, and maybe in the context of terminating with cause, right? And
yeah, terminating with cause and terminating without cause are two very different things. In this case, they're paying severance, so they're likely terminating without cause. And that's always the safest approach. As long as you're paying an appropriate level of severance, then there shouldn't be any ramifications that come of that. Again, employees are free to seek legal advice and to do whatever they want after the case. So that's why if you are going to terminate employees, it's really important to get legal releases that can protect you in the future.
Interesting situation. There is another one. An employee indicates they have a respiratory health concern that leaves them, and the employee believes them that they're at higher risk, even though they vape quite a bit, and has refused to do the required work as a result of that. Can they be laid off or let go with it being constructive dismissal?
So it would be considered constructive dismissal. In this case, because they're your employee and they're specifically raising a health issue, that's when your duty to accommodate comes in. So now you have to look at your duty to accommodate. You're going to have to get some medical information, and you're going to have to look at, are there ways at the workplace that you can modify it to be able to help this individual? But basically, you're going to fall under that accommodation requirement.
There's another question. Some are jumping back in. We've got 9 to go and about 8 minutes. If someone has been given required 2 weeks notice and yet still works a bit of part-time, how should the employer manage the ROE?
That is a very good question. I don't know. I'm not familiar with filling out the ROEs, so I apologize. I can't really give advice on that one.
Yeah, you check with, if you have someone doing your payroll or your bookkeeper, that
Yeah.
that is an issue right now, right, of how you manage that, because some have fallen into, and that's why that 13-week period, you basically severed your relationship, right?
Exactly.
So when you go to bring them back, they may not be there, but communication. So thanks for that question. Are there any rules regarding how long you need to wait before terminating an employee if they refuse to come back to work, if the employer has done all the measures required to keep it? So there's a gap. You've said you're restarting. We've done all the due diligence. We're going to respect the orders. The clock is ticking. Does it tick right away? Should there be a reasonable time that an employer
Part
waits?
of it's going to depend on what your policies are. You're likely going to have to undergo some sort of progressive discipline and able for it to be able to hold up as a termination under that. So those are the things you need to consider moving forward, is sending those letters saying, okay, well, as a result of you not coming back, you're going to be suspended for this period of time. If you don't come back again, then you're going to be suspended for a further period of time, and then you're going to be terminated. So laying it out and having those clear policies defined in your workplace.
Right, and then having that documentation so that you have it available. So that's what that
Absolutely
dismissal process, right?
Yeah.
Great. Does COVID change the exemptions for working notice severance in terms of exceptions? For example, those working at one or more construction sites for a company whose primary business is construction means that the employers are not required to provide working notice or severance. Do you have any insight regarding how or if COVID affects the construction industry layoffs? So this is a specific sector where you have a trade that might move back and forth, right?
Yeah, and it doesn't affect that. Any of the layoffs that are currently part of what's regular in the industry are going to be upheld as being regular in the industry.
There was, Kathleen asked a question. She was in another webinar, and there was lots of these going on, that the fourth reason for temporary layoff is doctrine of frustration. Frankly, I don't think I've heard that before. If unable to perform the duty for unforeseen circumstances other than bankruptcy and COVID-19 would be an example of that. In that case, then would you still need the employee to agree if it wasn't in their contract or typical in the industry? There's a detailed question. Doctrine of frustration.
And that depends. So that falls under that the one provision that I mentioned under the employment standards. And there's specific rules around that. So it has to be impossible. So you could, if you have the opportunity for somebody to work from home and to carry out work, then it wouldn't be impossible. So you're really looking at, is it absolutely impossible? So for example, if you ran a small restaurant where you weren't able to have any social distancing or anything like that, and you had to close it down completely, then you may qualify under that as well.
Interesting. Would the need to inspect a home extend to those of independent contractors? So what's the obligations of an employer that has independent contractors? As an example, this question talks about music teachers working remotely, but I think it would apply to those independent contractors.
Yeah, so anybody who's an independent contractor, if the arrangement is done properly, should actually be paying their own workers' compensation, and they're not considered your employee because they're considered an independent contractor. So you're only responsible for your employees. So you wouldn't have that same responsibility for an independent contractor. They're seen as a completely separate party from you.
Yeah, I once had a neighbor who got into problems when they had an independent contractor doing their roof, and WorkSafeBC came by and reminded the homeowner that you have an obligation to ensure a safe work environment for the roofing company that weren't using others. So knowing what your responsibility is always a good thing. So that's why, Mark, we appreciate having you. Could you possibly share a written list of healthy safety requirements that need to be complied with in order to make your workspace safe for employees? As we close here, Mark, any guidance that you give or resources that you could point people towards to get more information?
Yeah, definitely. So there are a number of resources that are on the WorkSafeBC site that deal with some of what the requirements are going to be in terms of the health and safety requirements. That's the best resource because each workplace is going to be so individual that it's going to be difficult to give just a general list that is going to be required in each workplace, as well as there may be special situations that are going to be required depending on your unique situation.
Right, well, we've got a few more questions in, so I'll try to get to those in the time that we have remaining. After the day off, the employee claimed that we have to pay them for the day off. Okay, so they took a day off. The employee claimed that we have to pay them for that day off since they needed a day off to recover from stress due to COVID-19, and it turned into sick leave for a day. So it's an interesting situation.
Yeah, so I believe that's the one that had unpaid sick leave. If it is unpaid sick leave and they take a sick day, then it's unpaid.
For temporary layoffs, if it is not the specific employee contract, so it's not in the employee contract, would it be okay to implement this into an office policy?
The law specifically says that it has to be in the employment contract and not just an office policy.
Excellent. If you have a duty to accommodate but would prefer to terminate the employee, can you pay severance and move on without additional concerns?
Quick answer is no, because you always have your duty to accommodate. And if you do terminate them based on some sort of disability as a result of your duty to accommodate, you will likely face some sort of discrimination case.
All right, so one last one in the queue. But again, if you have questions, feel free. And what we'll do afterwards, Mark, we can get those questions. I'll get them to you. We'll answer all those questions. And again, we'll post this shortly on our website so you can go back and review the record version. Another question, quick one here. We do have a couple of employees who don't have full buy-in for their current pandemic. So I'm assuming, okay, they have some doubts around it. Once again, we return to regular business. Does their probation period, okay, I get it, period begin again? So the new employees, and once we make strict COVID policies, if an employee is dismissed, is dismissive of those precautions and doesn't adhere to policies, can they be let go within their new probation period? So interesting scenario with new employees, right?
It is. So part of it's going to depend on how you define your probation period and how long it is. Some contracts have that if there's gaps, then the probationary period is suspended during those gaps. Other ones, the probationary period simply runs from the date that they started. So it's going to be key to look at what your employment contract says. In most cases, as long as it's in good faith, you can let go an employee during their probation period.
Great. Mark, we're coming to the end. I'm going to give you an opportunity just to quickly wrap things up. We're speaking with Mark Grabas from Pushor Mitchell. Great discussion and conversation this morning about labor law. I suspect we'll be talking about labor law. Well, you certainly will. It's your business, but a lot of uncertainty. So any final thoughts that you want to share with the group?
No, that's about it. I would check out the resources at WorkSafeBC. Check out the government websites as well in terms of what the recommendations are, as well as what the suggested options are going forward. And good luck to everyone out there. And hopefully we're going to see all of the businesses reopening soon.
Would you make yourself available? I know you're extremely busy, but perhaps
Absolutely.
down the road we can bring you back if we get some additional questions. And if those that have joined us have additional questions, feel free to send us that by email. You can check out our links through the Kelowna Chamber. We'll pass those on to Mark and make sure we get those general questions answered for you. Mark, I want to thank you on behalf of the Chamber for joining us on what is always a busy time, particularly now in labor law. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Dan. I really appreciate it.
All right, we're going to wrap things up. Just a couple of things just to note before we go. I want to thank Mark for joining us again. Mark with Pushor Mitchell, one of our proud members of the Kelowna Chamber. On the screen, you'll see the OK Kelowna, we've got this. OK, we've got this. It's the rallying cry that the chambers have been used. We're harnessing the entrepreneurial spirit that exists and built the Okanagan into one of the fastest growing regions in the country, and hopefully we'll continue that momentum. You can find out lots of information, including a recording of this and other webinars in our Business Smart series on our website under the OK, We've Got This initiative. Next week, we're going to shift to a little bit of softer employment environment. So we're going to talk about stress and dealing with stress in the workplace. We're pleased to have Iwana Sayenko in joining us from Healthy Transitions, also a Chamber member. So we want to thank her for joining us. That will be next Thursday morning at 9:30 here on Business Smarts Online. On behalf of everyone here at the Kelowna Chamber and the Chamber Network, the strongest business network in the country, I want to thank you for joining us. Have a safe and healthy day.